Before we get started, I just wanted to bring to your guys' attention that DoomRulz has furnished me with a glossary, or at least the beginnings of a glossary. His channel is going to be in the description box, and I want you guys to go over there and subscribe to his channel. The glossary has been posted on my website, that is sheddingoftheego.com. There's going to be a link in the description box, and I want you guys to go over there and give suggestions for what you want to include. This is going to be constantly revised and constantly updated, but I think it's a very good start, and I want to thank DoomRulz for that. So again, please go subscribe to his channel. We're going to, work is being conducted on the book today as we speak, so we're going to talk about that again soon. But for now, I just want to talk briefly about transhumanism and social justice warriors and feminists. As many of you guys know, one of my interests surrounds the future of human development, things like transhumanism and how the future of human development is going to eventually relate to the steady creep of technological advancements. And this is a subject that, as you guys know, I've talked about at length in previous videos. I think it's imperative that we take interest in how human nature affects technology and vice versa, since, as we know, a single technological development, things like female birth control, for example, can have widespread, long-lasting, and often chaotic effects on the process of human male and female gender interaction. It could be argued that feminism could not have existed without the innovation of female contraception, as it can also be argued that the advent of a male birth control pill will have far-reaching pro-male effects on the theater of human interaction, and all of this falls under the umbrella, if you will, of transhumanism. We are using technology, things like contraception, to rise above and do away with the restrictions that our biology has placed on us as human beings. We're using technology to expand our capabilities as a species. And thus, it is with great interest then that I watch what appears to be the latest manifestation of feminist and thus, to a degree, female incursion into the transhumanist realm. I want to bring to your attention the following article titled "The Sexual Politics of Transhumanism," and I think this article demonstrates what I believe to be the beginnings of such an incursion. And so let's just get into the relevant text right now. The article basically makes the argument that there is sexism and misogyny creeping into transhumanism, and the author says, quote, "How does this tie into transhumanism in the media? While I am not saying that the movement or ideology of transhumanism is inherently misogynistic in any way, I cannot ignore a wide spectrum of trends which lead me to believe that the conception of modern transhumanism is being too strongly influenced by patriarchal worldviews. For now, instead of trying to immediately prove the point with words, I think my best approach here will just be to show you what I mean with images that have been used throughout media to represent transhumanist ideals." End quote. After showing numerous pictures depicting images of what appears to be sentient robotic beings of the female form, which I'll display in the video, he then goes on to say, quote, "Has it become clear yet what we're talking about and why it needs to be discussed? Male representations of transhumanism are nowhere near as sexualized as female representations. Male bodies are never partitioned in the same way the above bodies have, in vulnerable, incomplete, or submissive poses, making sure to include any and all body parts that may offer sexual stimulation. Interlaced with this issue, if you take another look at the images, are themes of race and conventional Western beauty standards." End quote. The comments in reaction to the Reddit post where I found this article were mostly supportive of the author's opinions. There was one that said, quote, "Oh boy, more SJW dribble infecting our future ideals," but that was it. So I want to ask you, gentlemen, are you starting to notice a pattern here with how feminists and social justice warriors approach these things? It's really all the same wherever you go. Every time there's a new emergent philosophy or movement and it gains increasing interest, there exists a feminist somewhere attempting to steer the conversation towards how it can better accommodate women. This phenomenon is the perpetual revolution of gynocentric advance. It seeks for all places and communities and philosophies, etc., to pander to the female, and worse yet, it creates and innovates and contributes nothing. And I think really that it is up to men to learn how to not only identify this behavior, but to meet it head first and nip it in the bud whenever it rears its ugly head. So with that said, I do want to start an analysis into the feminist incursion into transhumanism. And in doing so, I think it appropriate to mention the newest sci-fi film that I'm very excited over. That is the film titled Ex Machina, which is an exploration into the Turing test, which most of you I'm sure are familiar with. This is a test that's designed to be able to test the ability of a machine to provide conversation and emulate emotion and other human behaviors in such an accurate way so as to render it indistinguishable from its human equivalent. Now, an Ex Machina, an advanced sentient robot of the female form, is the subject of this Turing test. Naturally, this has enraged some feminists somewhere, resulting in an article titled, quote, Ex Machina has some serious fembot problems. And this article starts out as follows. It says, quote, the Turing test detects if a machine can truly think like a human. The Bechdel test detects gender bias in fiction. If you were to mash the two together to create a particularly messy Venn diagram, the overlap shall henceforth be known as the Ex Machina zone. I've always had a serious problem with the validity of the Bechdel test, which is a test that states that a movie can only pass this test if a work of fiction features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. The Bechdel test wiki also states the following. It says, quote, originally conceived for evaluating films, the Bechdel test is now used as an indicator of gender bias in all forms of fiction. Now, the problem that I have with the Bechdel test is that it says nothing conclusive about the film. It proves nothing and simply applies a conclusion, the conclusion of gender bias, without providing sufficient evidence. It just makes this blanket observation that if two women aren't talking about anything other than men, that it is a de facto source of sexism, and that this suggests some hypothetical flaw in the character of the creator of the work. And this is a hallmark of feminist social justice warrior encroachment into creative spaces they do not help to build. That is, the desire to dictate towards communities that they don't contribute to what is, quote, proper behavior according to them. It is cultural blackmail. It's a religious church appropriating a scientific community for its own agenda and demanding that tithes be paid if they don't want to go before the Inquisition. This Bechdel test is really analogous to drawing a conclusion of child bias if children aren't portrayed in works of fiction as having anything to talk about other than their parents. One could also likely ask of every action film, probably ever, if a set number of male characters aren't portrayed in acts of violence toward other men. Under this criteria, movies like Lord of the Rings or Saving Private Ryan and many others would fail miserably, and yet I would still want to see the movies. I would still want to watch Lord of the Rings because I like the movie. You know, you really have to sometimes try to attempt to understand the thought process of the feminists and social justice warriors as to how they could honestly justify such a blatant disregard for creative expression, finding bias where there is none, in hopes of exerting what amounts to thinly veiled censorship onto the creative powerhouses that make up our comic and gaming culture. You really have to ask yourself, what could motivate these people to be so mentally debile that they need to go around policing the creative efforts of others to see if they've paid enough attention to them? And that's really what it's all about, whether or not you've paid enough attention to them. And ironically, these types then often cite that they have found endemic oppression in the pages of a comic book or in the scenes of a video game because of an over-representation of anything that is not them. Right? Their entire superstructure of victimology collapses under its own weight when eventually it's outed that the entire thing, right, this entire stinking thing has just been an exercise in narcissistic self-adulation and praise in which they are not happy until the entire world sings their praises. The article continues further and says, quote, in writer/director Alex Garland's thought-provoking new film out Friday, we meet Ava, an artificially intelligent robot. Ava's creator, genius tech billionaire Nathan, has asked his employee Caleb to determine whether Ava's thinking is indistinguishable from a human's. Until she meets Caleb, Ava has only ever met her maker and one other woman, hence the failing of the Bechdel test, which stipulates that a movie must feature two female characters who talk to each other about something other than a man. Her existence and her ability to learn how to interact is a fascinating study of what makes us human. It's also a compelling, if problematic, look at the interactions between men and women, or at least that's what I thought. While interviewing Garland for a magazine piece, I asked him about the roles of men and women in his film. His response was that Ava is not a woman, she is literally genderless. Despite using female pronouns, he said, the things that would define gender in a man and woman, Ava lacks them, except in external terms. I'm not even sure that consciousness itself has a gender, end quote. Now, I disagree with Garland here. Consciousness, to the degree that it can currently be defined, absolutely does have a gender, or at least a sex. Now, if we were to take all of the male and female human biomass on this planet and conduct tests as to their thoughts and their desires or other factors one could attribute to their consciousness, we would see, I think, both men and women's consciousness displaying patterns that are non-trivial, statistically significant, and typical to each gender. Now, I can perhaps see where I'm misinterpreting his words if we define consciousness as anything other than what we've called on this channel lizard brain behavior, which we can define as any behavior rooted in the instinctual drives of the human being on a spectrum of subconsciousness to consciousness. A woman consciously dressing in high heels so as to attract a taller mate, subconsciously, would probably be an example of such behavior. If we remove these behaviors, that is, conscious behavior based on subconscious instinctual drives, assuming anything would be left over, then perhaps it could be said that consciousness has no gender. But I think this begs the question, is it even possible to remove gender from consciousness? This is an unanswerable question when we take into account our very feeble understanding of consciousness at all. It is debatable, after all, whether or not we even have consciousness or free will in the first place. We live in a world where seemingly random events like Brownian motion can actually be explained simply by the precepts of Newtonian motion, and one could make the argument that we're just matter capable of awareness towards other matter, and thus we are too, it seems, bound to a prison of what are the most likely interactions of matter to take place. If we have any kind of relation in terms of matter to our consciousness, then it would seem so that it is absolutely destined to be everything. But scientists, of course, have uncovered the exotic world of the quantum now, where on a subatomic level, matter can exist in all sorts of apparent randomness. But, again, as a quantum system approaches classical scale, they experience quantum decoherence and yet again yield to the world of Newtonian physics. So, who knows? I often wonder myself if consciousness is the same way, having this dualistic quality of determinism and randomness working together in tandem. But this is an answer for scientists and philosophers to dwell on. We'll continue with the article. It says, quote, "In a way, Garland is right. Pure intelligence wouldn't have a gender any more than it would have a race. But to say that and then place that consciousness into a body that it will immediately recognize its likeness as a female negates that point." End quote. Now, I'd have to assume that placing an artificial intelligence in a female body and expecting it to live and interact with other human beings would simply put this artificial intelligence in the unique predicament categorized by the Alien Observer test. I've talked about this before, but it states basically that an alien observer descending on our planet tasked with developing an understanding of the human animal, having no instinct for sexism, would determine the true nature of male and female human interaction devoid of any bias. Thus, Ava would return with the assistance of a presumably exceedingly powerful computation system, that is, artificial intelligence. She would return the natural condition of how our society, both men and women, interact with women. This is anathema to the social justice warrior feminist doctrine because it knocks down the fragile tabula rasa-inspired mistakes they've been passing off as explanations for things like sexism for decades now, and as a result, this is a truth that must be bandied around or not spoken of at all. He continues and says, "If Ava has truly been educated about the human race, then she knows her face and form appeal to certain segments of the population." And this, gentlemen, is what I mean by the term that certain truths must be bandied about in the social justice warrior lexicology. Is it not sexism or gender bias for the author to assume that there are groups of people, and in this case, let's be honest, he means men, that would find Ava appealing simply on the basis of her feminine appearance alone? Is it okay for the author to harken back to evil psych-based realities that state that the male sex wants the most young and fertile and neotenous females, when it bolsters his hypothesis that implies sexism towards women. Can it not be said that perhaps movies that fail your Bechdel test may also have some basis in what, quote, appeals to certain segments of the population and thus are there for a reason? Here's an interesting Gallup poll showing that women, more so than men, prefer a male boss over a female one. And all of this is going to be in the description box. It says women fighting for a broader presence in the upper levels of management face at least one very personal obstacle. Most workers don't want them there. Only 1/5 of people surveyed by Gallup this week said they preferred a female boss over a man. 1/3 preferred a male boss, and the rest had no preference at all. The survey, which collected responses from 1,032 adults living in the US, found women were more likely than men to want a male boss. 39% of women wanted to be led by a man, compared with 26% of men. In the 60 years that Gallup has conducted this survey, women have never preferred a female boss. So again, a survey comprising of thousands of people over the course of 60 years, and not a single time have women preferred a female boss. Isn't that incredible? We have to now ask the question, is this sexism too? Is this gender bias too? And if so, on the part of whom? If it is at all on the part of men, then you must also admit that it is even more so on the part of women. And to social justice warriors like the author of this article, such a phenomenon must absolutely be grounded in some conspiratorial patriarchy or some malevolent, shadowy sexism that simply does not exist. When in fact, it is based on the preference women seem to naturally exhibit throughout history of selecting confident men who provide them direction. I'm not saying this is correct or incorrect, but simply what is. In fact, I myself urge men to stop taking on women that see them as nothing more than a means by which they can coast through life on easy mode by allowing a man's confidence to make all major decisions for her, so that she can eventually blame him if everything goes wrong, of course. I believe that this exploits men, and I believe that this infantilizes women, but the difference between myself and the author is that if men don't choose to follow my advice, I don't then try to censor or at least bitch about these themes being reiterated on the silver screen and in wider culture. I just get on with my life and deal with it. The author continues and says, but even thornier is the fact that Ava falls squarely into so many of the tropes of women in film. She's a femme fatale, she's a seductress posing as a damsel in distress, using her wiles to get Caleb to save her from Nathan and his Dr. Frankenstein with tech money quest to build a perfect woman. And then he says in parentheses, women, so much better that you can construct them out of bespoke parts and switch them off if they're not working properly. Am I right? End quote. Ah, yes, those evil tropes, right? This is the new boogeyman of the feminist push to find sexism any and everywhere that is new, interesting, and fascinating. The transhumanist community, for example. Of course, there's no mention of the countless men slaughtered in futuristic sci-fi war flicks. No mention that in the recent science fiction flick The Edge of Tomorrow, I counted 2-3 female soldiers in a literal sea of disposable male grunts embarking on a mechanized invasion large enough to dwarf Normandy. And this was an invasion they had to repeat over and over hundreds of times. So assuming that this force was approaching numbers of 1 million men, and that this giant military offensive was repeated hundreds of times over, we're talking about men being slaughtered on a scale that the world literally has never seen before. Are we now, then, to prepare a test to make men feel better about themselves now? Should we formulate our own version of a Bechdel test to make us feel special, right? Should we bully everybody else and make them adhere to this test, stifling the creative process in the process? Or should we just watch the movie and enjoy it for what it is, like normal adult human beings would? In this little part he says where, women are so much better when you can construct them out of bespoke parts and switch them off if they're not working properly, the author must, on some level, be aware that this statement is absolutely preposterous. Ava plays a machine. She is not a woman, nor is a woman being switched off if she's not working properly. A machine is being switched off, right? Are we going to find sexism in our iPhone Siri next? Is that where we're going to look next? To shut off a machine is not, under any circumstances, to shut off a person. We're going to be talking about this more in depth. And again, getting to work on the book, gentlemen, I think this is going to be very special. Stay tuned, gentlemen. More to come.